Welcome back. I'm Keith Morrison, continuing with our story, The Feud. Point of view can change everything, can't it? Perspective. Even in the crisp, clear Montana air, where here inside the grand old courtroom, the view was about to get decidedly hazier.
It's about self-defense. That's what this case is about.
This is Joe Campbell's attorney, Greg Jackson, who wanted the jury to see a justifiable shooting by a terrified man in fear for his own life.
As Joe Campbell looked into that barrel, he was faced with the horrifying decision at that point. Try to stay alive or die.
All that fancy forensic testimony, bolstered by legendary forensic pathologist Dr. Werner Spitz, to show Joe first shot Tim in the back, just spin, said the defense. Besides, the defense had its own legend, pathologist Dr. Vincent DeMaio, who wrote the book on gunshot wounds, and said,
"You have to have some description as to where the shooter is, and then you could say, this is consistent, or no, it's not consistent at all."
And in this case, Dr. DeMaio came to a far different conclusion than the prosecution experts.
There is nothing to disprove Mr. Campbell's story.
Dr. DeMaio offered his own theory that Tim could have been jumping or falling backwards when the first bullet hit his hand and chest, and then the second shot hit him in the back. Dueling experts? Maybe they'd canceled each other. But if Joe Campbell was going to walk out of the courtroom a free man, the defense had to hope the jury perceived him and her in a favorable way.
Joe Campbell's my husband.
And so here was Tanny Converse, Joe Campbell's wife.
And how long have you two been married?
23 years.
And the only other survivor of that confrontation on the Hill. So far you've heard that Joe Campbell was a bully.
And there isn't any right-of-way through here.
That he was a threatening, mean, and dangerous old man, unafraid and aggressive. But Tanny told the jury that in the weeks before the shooting, it was Tim Newman driving a pickup who confronted them as they walked to their horse pasture.
He said, "Joe and Tanny, I finally found you." Joe just said, "Tim, we've given you a notice that you're not welcome on our place. Please don't harass us."
Were you afraid of him when you were next to the road
I was
there?
startled. Joe just said, "Let's go." And he just hollered out his window, "Come on, let's just get it over with right now." And then he did drive off.
And that's why, she said, she and Joe were afraid of Tim. And why, on October 18th, as she and Joe walked toward home, they were alarmed to see Tim coming up behind them.
What were the things that made you believe that he was going to physically harm you?
Well, if he was just wanting to cut the lock, why would he chase us up the hill? Why would he do that? We were watching him. He was on his ATV and he was off his ATV and he was grabbing the bolt cutters. He was unpredictable. He was highly agitated.
So what do you and Joe decide to do next?
Joe just kept saying, "You need to try to get out of here. You need to try to get safe. You need to try to get home. You need to call the sheriff." I didn't want to leave Joe.
But she did leave, she said, and on her way to calling 911, heard gunshots, placed the call, rushed back, and...
I saw Joe standing at the gate, and he said he came at me with a gun, and I didn't have a choice. And then I saw Mr. Newman lying on the ground.
In their sometimes intense cross-examination, prosecutors pointed out, not so gently, that elements of Tanny's story had changed also from previous interviews. But altered or not, her story was emotional, as was Joe Campbell's.
Call Joe Campbell to the stand.
So, kindly and sometimes frightened grandfather of 7? Or neighborhood bully, the man who brandished weapons at neighbors and strangers alike? The defense set about changing perceptions.
On private property without permission.
The neighbors? The hunters?
Did you threaten him with a shotgun, anything of that nature?
No, just they were trespassing. I asked them to leave.
The Army colonel and her father?
ever point a shotgun at him?
No, sir.
But there was no getting around the fact that he told the deputy DA he was going to take care of Tim Newman himself. Couldn't be more than one way to perceive that. Could there?
We were going to take a legal action. We were really frustrated. I was really frustrated.
Legal action? That's how he intended to take care of Tim Newman, said Joe. He was just a peaceful but frustrated man, he said, and he was terrified when Tim Newman chased Tandy and him up the hill in a rage that day in October 2013. The man had murder in his eyes, said Joe.
It's hard to stand up here and say in front of everybody, but I was trying to stay alive. So I wanted to. I was thinking about Tanny, thinking about my kids, my grandkids. It's him or me, and I shot him. I did.
Had Joe Campbell succeeded in changing the jury's perception? Before Mr. Campbell could leave the witness stand, Prosecutor Dan Kaczynski got a chance to cross-examine him and again present the bully of the mountain the neighbors said they knew all too well.
Lamont Moultrie says that approximately 2-3 days before you shot and killed Mr. Newman, that you told him, I am going to put him down. Did you say that to Mr. Moultrie?
I did not.
So all these people came into court, took an oath, and have lied in front of this jury. Is that right?
Objection, Your Honor.
Ultimately, the prosecutor said, Joe Campbell could have avoided a confrontation. Could have, but did not, because he wanted it.
All you have to do to save your wife, to save yourself, is to turn downhill and walk, jog, run down that hill to safety.
Well, I looked at some of those options, Mr. Kaczynski, and it's a hell of a lot harder up there on the hillside when somebody's threatening you than it is to stand here in a courtroom 2.5 years later.
So, if you were a juror, what would you think about Joe Campbell and the gunplay on the mountain? Was it murder or self-defense? Coming up, waiting for the jury,
There's so much anxiousness.
hoping for justice.
Who is this guy that can just steal such a beautiful soul from this world?
When the feud continues.